This isn't the real Caesar's Palace, is it?
What do you mean?
Did Caesar live here?
No.
I didn't think so.
I went to Vegas last weekend. Pretty crazy.
Vegas, baby, Vegas!
Gentlemen, welcome to Las Vegas.
Why don't you give me half the money you were gonna bet? Then we'll go out back, I'll kick you in the nuts, and we'll call it a day.
Some guys just can't handle Vegas.
Hey there, and welcome to episode number 46 of the Jeff Does Vegas podcast. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your tour guide for this podcast journey to what I like to think of as the best city on the planet, fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. To start, I want to thank my guest from the last episode of the show, my good friend Mark Chinook, the host and creator of Monday's Dark. Mark was kind enough to find time in his insane schedule to sit and chat with me during the preparations for the Monday's Dark 6th anniversary celebration, marking $1 million raised for local Las Vegas charities. If you haven't listened to the episode as of yet, jump into the archives wherever you get your podcasts and search out episode number 45. Also, a big thanks to everyone who's taken the time to complete the audience survey. Lots of amazing feedback coming in on the podcast, but I'm always looking for more. If you've got opinions on the show, please share them with me by clicking the audience survey link on the website at jeffdoesvegas.com. All right, let's get things going. When people think of burlesque, they usually think of scantily clad or perhaps even topless or naked women on stage, titillating and teasing crowds with their seductive dance moves. But there's way more to it than that, as you're about to learn. My guest for this episode of the show is Dustin Wax, the executive director of one of the most unique attractions in Las Vegas, the Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum, which, by the way, is the only burlesque museum in the world. Dustin was kind enough to connect and chat with me about the history, mission, and vision of the Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum, as well as their annual Burlesque Hall of Fame weekend and Miss Exotic World Pageant. We also talked about the history of burlesque, not just in Las Vegas, but all over the world. He educated me on the evolution of burlesque into stripping and exotic dancing. We talked about the resurgence of burlesque over the last decade or so, and the differences between the classic burlesque show and what currently passes for burlesque on the Las Vegas Strip. Please enjoy my conversation with Dustin Wax of the Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum. First of all, Dustin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to sit and chat with me today. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here.
So I'd like to start just a little bit by talking about the history of the Burlesque Hall of Fame, if we can. Where was it conceived? Where did the idea come from? Who created it? Just some of the background on the Burlesque Hall of Fame.
Sure. So the idea comes from our founder, Jenny Lee. Jenny Lee was exotic dancer in the 1950s, and in the mid-50s, she was working out in LA, and conditions for strippers in LA weren't that good. So she organized the Exotic Dancers League. They were all members of the American Guild of Variety Artists, but they weren't really doing anything to help exotic dancers. So she starts the Exotic Dancers League as sort of a section of that, to kind of agitate for them, to help them, but also to agitate for conditions to be improved in local clubs, to get better pay, to get stuff like heaters in their dressing rooms, private dressing rooms, stuff like that. And they were pretty successful in LA, so they have an annual meeting for the union. But the annual meeting is leaning more and more towards a social event. So they start a softball team, they start a bowling team. They go to shows, as well as doing just the normal, whatever, agenda items they have to deal with that year. And there's a lot of sort of publicity based into this. Sort of, they issue a resolution that exotic dance should be taught to American housewives so that they can better serve their husbands and have better marriages. Which is clearly a kind of publicity stunt more than a formal sort of thing that they're going to be doing activism for. So anyway, in the 60s, to the annual meeting, they send the invitation out and they say, hey, bring your photos and let's start a Burlesque Hall of Fame. And people start bringing their photos. And she has a bar called the Sassy Lassie in San Pedro. And they start putting up these photos in the bar, and people start bringing costume pieces and putting them up on the wall. And pretty soon she has a pretty nice big collection.
And so when did it become an official Hall of Fame per se? And then, of course, when did the move to Las Vegas happen?
So she's showing it in her bar until the early 80s. She gets diagnosed with breast cancer and has to leave LA. They buy a goat ranch out in the middle of nowhere in Hallandale, California, and move the collection out there to start. It has many, many different names. Sometimes it's the Burlesque Hall of Fame. Sometimes it's the Exotic Dance Hall of Fame. Sometimes it's the Exotic Dance Museum. Sometimes it's Exotic World. Exotic World's the name that sticks. And she starts this museum and a school, and a bunch of performers, retired performers by this point, come out and live there for different lengths of time. And that becomes a very important sort of site for the rise of the neo-burlesque, the burlesque revival in the 90s. Jenny Lee passes away, and Exotic World is taken over by Dixie Evans, another performer from the 50s. And she runs that until 2005 out there in the desert. And she runs this competition, which we still do, the Miss Exotic World competition. It has its 30th anniversary next year. And that starts bringing people out there to these new people that have learned about burlesque from books and old magazines and movies, and maybe they don't even know it's burlesque yet. They just started doing some kind of artistic thing where they take their clothes off and they hear about it. They start going out there for these events to meet the former generations and so on. So it becomes a really important link between the classic burlesque era and the new burlesque era. And then in 2005, there's a storm and the roof caves in, and it is an old goat ranch on the edge of being condemned the entire time they're there. And they don't have the resources to fix it. And so they move the collection out here to Las Vegas, at first thinking they're going to store it out here in a dry place until they can fix the old place up. But like I said, that doesn't become possible. So in 2010, we open a tiny little space on Fremont Street, about 225 square feet, this tiny little closet of a space. And the idea was that we would sort of have a little tease of what we have while we were building towards opening new museums. And we opened the museum that we're in now on Main Street last March.
It's still got that new car smell, so to speak, where you are right now.
Where we are right now, yeah, it's still very much the new museum. But, parts of our collection are 50 years old, so they also have that old storage smell.
I want to talk a little bit about the history of burlesque, sort of in general, and where it all sort of started and where it all came from. And I mean, I guess also too, wanting to kind of clarify burlesque versus exotic dancing versus stripping. Are they all within the same vein? Are they all the same thing? Are they all very different things? Because I think maybe there's that stigma surrounding burlesque that it is the same as exotic dancing and stripping. I guess maybe they're all different degrees. You will know more about this than I do.
Right. I'll start with just the history, and then we get into sort of the differences as we go. So the history of burlesque is old. It's long. Burlesque, in its purest sense, is just a theatrical form that's based on parody and exaggeration. So in that sense, it's existed since as long as theater, since ancient Greeks. The kind of burlesque that we talk about gets started in the mid 19th century as taking sort of well-known plays or well-known stories and writing these kind of ribald, parodic versions of them. And the big innovation when it comes to America is it's mostly led by female theater troupes who do the male parts as well as the female parts. So they're cross-dressing in their roles, but they're not cross-dressing to look like men. They're cross-dressing to look like women in men's clothes.
Okay.
And so there's this very sort of unsettling nature to it, where it's very much a kind of way of sort of sticking in the eye of the powers that be to say, you know, these heroes aren't all that heroic. They're just, you know, after girls and wealth and greed and whatever. And then they're a little like, you know, they're sexually charged because the women are wearing, you know, men's uniforms, but you can see the shape of their legs, you can see the shape of their bodies. This is, you know, the sort of early mid-Victorian era where, you know, people are wearing those big poofy skirts and corsets, and their whole bodies are sculpted in a way to sort of cover up a lot of it. And you can see their legs. You can see, you know, they're wearing low cut tops so that you can see their chests to some degree. And that combines by the end of the century, by the end of the 19th century, with belly dancing, the hoochie cooch dance it was called, that had become popularized at the World's Fair in 1893, into this kind of variety show theatrical format that is very similar to vaudeville, although vaudeville is family entertainment and burlesque was decidedly not. So you have comics, you have skits, you have chorus girls, you have dancing, and that is burlesque in the early 1900s. It's the Minsky shows, the Ziegfeld shows, the sort of traveling shows are all built around this sort of variety format. And the comics are the big draw. Well, in the late 1920s, radio becomes popular and talking movies become a thing. I guess the movies are already popular, but they were even more popular now. And they needed comics. Both of them needed comics to do shows, to do variety hour on the radio, and to do movies. And Abbott and Costello and Bob Hope and all these people leave the burlesque theater for radio and the movies. And so vaudeville, of course, disappears within like 4 years. The last vaudeville house is closed. But burlesque has pretty dancing girls. And as they go to ever increasing lengths to hold their audiences, they develop striptease. And that's the real American innovation is the striptease dancing.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, really, it just started as you say, it was theater, it was parody, it was humor, but hey, let's take our clothes off and make it more interesting.
Right, exactly. And a lot of it is still very pointed and very funny. They're, acting out unfaithful husbands or seducing the pool boy or whatever. And so there's still an element of humor to it, but it's increasingly an eroticized form of entertainment humor. And after World War II, in the 1950s, burlesque starts to shrink the expenses. I guess there's economic forces at work where the club owners, burlesque moves from theaters into clubs, moves from clubs into bars. The people that are running this and trying to make money off of it get rid of the big bands and go down to a combo and eventually down to a drummer and eventually down to recorded music. And so you have a kind of gradual transition over the course of this 60s and 70s into modern exotic dance, into stripping. So that by the mid 70s, you have these, the girl show and Live New Girls, and there's not much of an act to it. There's more of people come out, instead of stripping on stage, they come out with very little on and remove that. And so it's much more of a focus on just the nude female body rather than on the theatrical elements of burlesque. And so there's no clear demarcation point, but burlesque, over the course of about a decade, turns from the older style that we would think of as a sort of glamour-focused theatrical form into the modern nude focused erotic entertainment. So in that sense, they're kind of cousins. What comes back in the 90s when people sort of rediscover burlesque is much more the theatrical elements of it and much less the erotic elements of it, although they're still there, but they become part of a tool of the theatrical presentation. And so modern burlesque, neo-burlesque, and exotic dance are cousins, maybe.
Right.
They're maybe second cousins. They share a root, but they don't share the economics are entirely different, right? Like you can be a exotic dancer and make a living at it. You can own an exotic dance club and make a ton of money. Very few burlesque dancers make money dancing on stage and doing their acts, although a lot of them make a living teaching or doing other related things. And as far as I know, there's maybe, a handful of outlets of venues that just focus on burlesque. It's not really a thing that there's a lot of places that just specialize in that the way there are strip clubs in every town.
Right. And so, with the history of burlesque being what it is, as you've kind of explained it to me, and that it's the entertainment level of it versus just, hey, live nude girls, it makes sense that Vegas really picked up on burlesque. Really, it's a city where people are after both. So, hey, why not combine them?
Yeah. Burlesque is really, if we look at the roots of Las Vegas entertainment, it's Lily St. Cyr coming here in the late 40s, early 50s, and performing a sort of traditional style burlesque show at the El Rancho with a comic, usually Joey Lewis. And I mentioned the Minskys before. The Minskys were a group of four brothers who all ran shows out in New York, and really shaped modern, Gypsy Rose Lee worked for them. All the big dancers in the sort of 20s and 30s worked for them. And the son of one of them, Harold Minsky, moves out to Las Vegas in 57. He starts the first topless review at the Dunes, and it's really based around the same model of a Minsky burlesque show, although a lot of it's choreographed. It's not necessarily the individual artist doing her thing. It's, an act that they hire someone to sort of fill. But the whole root of the modern showgirl show comes out of that. Pretty soon he's running shows at 7 different hotels, and other people are coming in and doing the same kinds of shows, the Lido de Paris and the Jubilee, and all these shows are modeled after that kind of burlesque inspired show. So yeah, it's really baked in here.
And you talked a little bit about burlesque seeing a real resurgence in the 90s. Why do you think that is? Where do you think that came from? I've seen it in working in radio and working in music, and the way people will discover music from the 80s or music from the 70s, and all of a sudden, there's a big resurgence of the Beatles in 2010 or whatever. Is it kind of a situation like that? Was it people looking specifically for something new? What's old is new again? Why do you think that resurgence happened?
I think the biggest thing I see is that in the early 90s, you had a whole generation of young women who had been raised with feminism, right? And so they were all raised with the idea that you can be whatever you want to be. You're going to have a career. You shouldn't feel constrained. There can be women doctors and women politicians and women CEOs and whatever else. And yet the society hadn't really changed to catch up with them that much. So they raised with those ideas, but it was still, they were still also told, well, you should probably not weigh more than 110, and you should probably wear a ton of makeup and always be pretty and don't learn a lot of math and whatever else. And so you see a whole bunch of different kinds of ways that women are looking to are looking for identities for themselves in the early 90s, right? You have the rockabilly revival, you have the roller derby revival, you have the riot girl movement in punk rock, you have all these different kinds of movements and subcultures emerging that are all to some extent looking backwards at previous sort of models, but also trying to modernize those and kind of reconcile them. So they're models of being women and being powerful without being 80s feminist women with the shoulder pads and the sort of man-eater stereotype of the 80s. Think of like Baby Boom or whatever, where you have these very powerful women that are frightening and very masculine. And so they're models of femininity that are also powerful. And I think that's a big part of it, is that they're sort of trying to play with all these different ideas and all these different ways of being women. And burlesque is one style that's a very hyper exaggerated form of femininity in its heyday. And it's also, more in line with the emerging sort of third wave feminism, sex positive feminism. It's not, if you think of the 70s feminism, there was, like the Society for Cutting Out Men and by choice lesbianism and so on, where they were really trying to just get away from the idea of sex as any part of the identity. And by the 90s, they're really trying to find ways to integrate sex into part of sex and sexuality into part of their personhood. And so I think all those things sort of crystallize for some people around burlesque. Burlesque also has this really theatrical element that's very similar to drag, where it's just way over the top. You can put on a giant 12-inch high wig and 3-inch long eyelashes and incredible makeup, and it's very theatrical. There's glitter and sparkle and whatever, and it creates a like a glam David Bowie type way of again playing with gender and playing with your identity and creating whole new people out of, or personas out of, who you are, and this kind of fantasy self.
And it's interesting that you bring in the discussion about feminism and the feeling of power and in control. I've talked to women that have done burlesque, and I have friends that have been involved in burlesque, and they've all said that. They've all said, there's that sort of myth that, these poor, quote unquote, poor girls that are being exploited for this. And they've all said, I don't feel exploited. I feel more powerful than I have ever felt in my life when I'm up there doing that.
Right, because when you're on stage, you're making choices. And you're choosing how to present yourself, and you're choosing what elements to kind of exaggerate and what to downplay, and you're owning all of that. And so there is, I don't know. And again, if I go back and I talk to the older performers that were performing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they hated feminists, right? Because feminists were out front marching to close down their clubs. But if you talk to everyone, I don't know anyone in the current scene that isn't to some degree doesn't to some degree consider herself to be a feminist. Even the there's a lot of male performers now. It's a new thing in the modern movement that they all are they're sort of very cognizant of being in this sort of feminist space and trying to sort of figure out the role of men as sort of supporters of this ideology. And yeah, everyone feels empowered because we still do live in a society that tells women to be smaller, to take up less space, to lose weight, to be pretty, to be to not have so much ambition, and we've seen it on everywhere from the workplace to the national stage, as women, running for office, for instance, get criticized for things that nobody would even think about in relationship to their male counterparts.
Well, exactly. Like you say, they'll get criticized for looking a certain way, dressing a certain way, weight or appearance. Whereas men, nobody's caring about that. So yeah, as you say, it's, I think it's interesting to look at it from that side, from the empowerment side. And as you say, going back with the quote unquote old timers, they felt the same way in a time when it was even perhaps looked at as being women were more repressed at that time, and we're figuring out a way to do that, and this was a way for them to do that.
Yeah, and it's why the modern burlesque movement really holds on to the older generations of performers. They call them legends, and legends with a capital L, and they become kind of feminist icons, and like I said, maybe to the chagrin of some of them, but they become feminist icons because they were marginalized people, often from very poor backgrounds, who made a life and a career for themselves that was frowned upon in the general society, but they were being paid a lot of money to do it, and they created personas that were not afraid to be sexual, not afraid to be to express that side of their womanhood at a time when no one was, women weren't supposed to express that side of their womanhood, right? The women were supposed to be June Cleaver with their, vacuum cleaners and just having dinner hot on the table when their man came home. And so today's burlesque performers look at those older performers as women who had this incredible strength and this incredible determination to live lives that they wanted to live rather than the lives that were imposed on them. So they, we bring, like I said, we still do this competition every summer. We do a whole big 4-day festival every summer around it, and we bring as many of them as we can. So last year we brought, I think, 46 legends, performers from everywhere from the 1940s up to the mid-70s to come. Some of them perform, some of them teach classes, but all of them come. We pay for their travel, we pay for their tickets, and we could just, because we want them to be there to be available for the new generation to learn from.
I think that's so cool. That's such an amazing idea and an amazing concept. And I would imagine that the legends, when they come back, they must just absolutely love coming back and speaking to that new generation of burlesque performers and people that want to be involved in that realm of entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole kind of, and again, this is sort of similar to the drag community. There's this whole kind of burlesque mama relationship where people are like, this so-and-so is my burlesque mother, and those older performers will say, oh yeah, these are my burlesque daughters, these 4 or whatever, that they have that almost like mentorship relationship, which is important because even today in burlesque, a lot of the women in the burlesque community don't have strong relationships with their families. A lot of them are doing something that their families, dislike because they're either religiously, religious fundamentals or whatever, or because they just see it as, well, it's stripping and no daughter of mine would ever be a stripper. So a lot of them, I don't know whether the chicken comes before the egg, but either they don't have a relationship with their family because of what they do, or they do what they do because they don't have a very good relationship with their family.
Right.
And so building these relationships with these older performers is really important for a lot of people in the modern burlesque community.
There's several burlesque shows and various types of shows that are in Las Vegas and on the Strip and off the Strip and elsewhere. How do you think they stack up compared to the classics? Are they even in the same ballpark, in the same league? Are they something different? Are they respected within the burlesque community? I don't know if respected is the right word, but what are your thoughts on some of the modern shows that are out there?
I will say, even though burlesque is very firmly rooted in Las Vegas entertainment, most of what happens on the Strip is not burlesque. And the difference is something I already sort of mentioned, which is the shows on the Strip tend to be scripted, choreographed shows, and then they hire people to fill those roles. And so if, some dancer twists their ankle one night, they can hire someone else to put into that same role. Whereas, the Tempest Storm was always Tempest Storm. You know, she did her acts, and no one could step in and sort of do her acts for her. And a lot of that is down to the sort of commercial nature of the strip. And, you know, everyone kind of complains that, you know, oh, well, when the mob ran things, you know, it was a lot more personable and whatever. And to some extent, that's true, in at least where the shows are concerned, that everything's run by, I think it's 4 corporations now that run almost every hotel on the strip.
Right.
And they're very focused on, just like Hollywood, you know, like, this is what will sell to the largest number of people. We don't want to challenge anyone. We don't want to make people think oogie thoughts. You know, we just want people to come in, see pretty girls do pretty girl stuff, and be mildly titillated, and then go out and gamble some more, go to the restaurant, spend $300 on dinner. So what you end up with is what the best of them I call burlesque adjacent. Something like Absinthe, or what's their show? Atomic Lounge, which is run by the same company. These are burlesque style shows. They have, you know, comics acting as MCs. There's a lot of humor. They're variety shows. You have the dancing girls. You even have, in Absinthe, you know, some traditional burlesque acts, like the you know, big balloon, you know, woman dancer with a big balloon act, which was originated by Sally Rand back in the 30s. But there's no striptease. No one removes a piece of clothing on stage. And you know, there's no, like I said, the parts are sort of the parts are written out, and then people are step into them. So you look at something like Absinthe, and there have been 3 green fairies and 3 different gazillionaires, which is the MC, and so there's much less of a personal expression aspect or element to it. That said, there's great shows. I mean, Absinthe is a phenomenal show. I recently saw Opium, which is another Spiegel tent show, also a phenomenal show. Some of the shows that have had burlesque in their titles have failed really badly, and been I haven't, you know, I never saw X Burlesque, but I never heard any good things about it either. So one of the shows that still runs that does do striptease is Zombie Burlesque, and I still haven't seen that one, but my sense is, again, it's mostly scripted, and they just hire actresses to do the different choreographed parts. Those are all fine. You know, Las Vegas is changing, and the kind of shows that people see, you know, Cirque has radically changed what people are willing to sit through. And now almost every show on the strip is a Cirque show.
Right.
And they're these big spectaculars, and they're more acrobatics than necessarily dance. And, you know, that's fine. It's just a different kind of show. But what we bring when we do our competition is, I find it to be way more entertaining. And I think a lot of it is because it is an individual person's expression rather than something that's been, you know, written by, you know, some corporation's team of producers and whatever else, and choreographers and directors and whatnot. And I love to see, you know, these individual people expressing themselves and saying something that only they could say. And so the kind of show that we do here is I feel, it's just a totally different league. You asked another question, which I'm not sure you meant to ask, but how today's burlesque sort of compares to the old days. We've been doing a series of film screenings here at the museum where we're showing some of the old 50s B movies, these burlesque movies. And these are really, I mean, they would film a bunch of acts, and then they'd slice them together in 20 different ways to make 20 different movies out of them. They're poorly acted. They're poorly filmed. They're all, you know, super cheap fly by night kind of films. And while I'm sure that some of these performers who were quite famous maybe had more energy when they were in front of a live audience, watching them on film, there's not that much to it at all. And when I look at some of the things that people do today, where they've integrated circus into it, for instance, people do, acts on, hoops hung from the ceiling or streamers hung from the ceiling, or they're doing contortionism. So that's one element where people have integrated hip hop dance and breakdancing and all kinds of sort of modern club dance styles into their performance. It's an incredibly, it's almost, it's basically a different form of performance, but there's a lot more show personship to it today. And I think a lot of it is just that it was so novel in 1950 to see someone take their clothes off on stage that people were like, oh, I'm in for this. Whereas nowadays, you can see anything in the world you want to on the internet, right? You just Google a search term and you can see any sex act you've ever imagined or that you couldn't even imagine. And so burlesque doesn't even have to try to like fill that niche. So it's all about the dance, and it's all about the story that's being told, and it's all about the humor, and it's all about all these things that in 1952, it was, the primary draw was that there was going to be some sexual element to it that you couldn't see anywhere else.
Well, and I feel too like you mentioned the individual expression and the individual connection, that person that's up there performing, as you say, that is them, as opposed to these large groups, like you say, like the Ex-Burlesque or an Absinthe or any of those shows, being that they might be great shows, they're very cookie cutter, they're very somewhat generic, whereas that person that gets up on the stage and performs a burlesque show for a live audience, that's all them. That's 100% them. That's their individual expression. And you also, too, the fun of getting up in front of a live audience like that is you never really know what the audience is going to bring to the show. So there might be that level of interaction between the performer and the audience as well, right?
Yeah, the best performers are always the ones that sort of seem locked in on their audience the whole time. And the audience is a big part of it. When you go to any burlesque show, and you're very likely to have an MC come out at the beginning of the show and say, how many of you have been to a burlesque show before? For those of you who haven't been here before, here's how it works. Like when you see something you like, you should scream and, clap your hands and yell and let them know. And that energy of people wooing and being part of it really is part of that experience. And of course, it's much more obvious in the kinds of small venues that most local shows take place in, where there are no big burlesque theaters anymore. So they go to bars or sometimes commercial spaces for commercial shows and perform in front of maybe 100 people, maybe 200 at the top, but mostly in that very sort of informal environment where they're very close to their audience. And again, you go to a Las Vegas show and you're in a big showroom and everything's just so, and they're on a stage that's sort of separated from, probably for good reason, separated from the audience, and they're not even designed with the idea that there is going to be any kind of interaction with the audience. You maybe have a comic that comes out and works the room a little bit, but other than that, for the dancers, that's not part of the root thing that they're trying to accomplish.
So I do want to talk about the Hall of Fame specifically as well. So how does one get inducted into the Burlesque Hall of Fame? How does that happen?
So we don't induct people. And it's an unfortunate trick of our name that people think of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame, they induct people. In our case, it's a name that Jenny came up with back in 1965 as just like, on the spur of the moment, let's start a Burlesque Hall of Fame. And when Exotic World closed, they wanted a new name that would, represent that the change from what that experience was to whatever the new experience was going to be, and they went back to this name, Burlesque Hall of Fame. What we do is we do an award every year for the Living Legend Award. It's called, where we choose a performer from the sort of pre-75 era to recognize for their contribution to the art. And we have a committee of people that nominates and votes on that every year. And we also do an award called the Sassy Lassie, which is more for recognizing people who contribute to the perpetuation of the art, which is, our sort of neo-burlesque award, the people in the 90s and aughts that sort of stepped forward and brought this art into the present. And that's also selected by, there's a nominating committee, and so we have a short list, and then every year we kind of work through the short list. So in a sense, I guess those are our inductees. But what we don't do is, like, if you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and they've inducted, whatever, David Bowie, and there's a case that has, the Thin Duke costume and the guitar he played and whatever. Like, we don't really have, if you come into the Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum, we don't have cases that represent individual performers in the same way, in part because we can't, because stuff got worn until it fell apart. A lot of stuff got destroyed. A lot of people, when they retired from burlesque, it's because they got married and they had a husband that didn't like it, or they found religion and they were people that burned their stuff or they threw it out. And a lot of people sold their costumes because that was a way they could make, good money when they were still sort of on the downslope, high up the downslope from being famous stars. And so there's very few people that we have a sort of representation of that would be similar to the kind of represent, you go Baseball Hall of Fame and there's their costume and their number and the bat that they use and whatever. We don't really have that.
Right.
It's hard to find any of this stuff because burlesque wasn't considered a central savable part of our culture, right? It was always considered something that was a little bit, it's a little bit dirty, and it's a little bit downscale, it's a little bit lowbrow.
Yeah, I was going to say lowbrow or sort of kept sort of underground, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's a little underground, it's a little lowbrow, it's women, and until like this week, our society hasn't really seen women's history as being that important to preserve. It's working women, it's erotic women, it's all these different, sort of axes that our society has always downplayed. And so this stuff didn't get preserved. Even the theaters, very few of the theaters even exist anymore, and they're almost all converted into other things.
So what type of items and artifacts then do you guys have in the actual museum? Is it posters? Is it video? Is it some costumes from newer performers?
Well, so we do have, we have the advantage of having been collecting for over 50 years. Mm-hmm. And so some of the stuff in the collection are costumes that were donated back then. Some of the stuff, we get fewer and fewer costumes now, but we still, try to find them when they come up. Of course, the big people that were really famous, their costumes tend to be out there, and people did collect them. Gypsy Rose Lee, for instance, we were able to show one of her costumes last summer. So we have that sort of 50-year collection of costumes and other material, and then we're trying to add to it, and it gets harder and harder to get costumes, but we're able to find film. We just added the Something Weird company collection. They collected all these, they do DVDs of old sort of B movies, and they have horror movies, and they have those old weird educational movies and whatever. But they collected all these burlesque films and converted them to VHS back in the 90s and then to DVD in the aughts. And they donated the entire collection of the original film stock to us. So we have that collection. We have thousands of photos, just promo photos, mostly from all these different performers. One of the things we ask is when we find a new legend and we're going to bring her out for the Weekender, we ask them to donate material that shows that they're a feature performer. Because we do a show and with all pre-1975 performers, they have to be featured performers from before 1975 to be considered for that show. So we need them. So we basically ask them to show us that they were a featured performer, and usually that's by giving us ad clippings, photos, other material that sort of shows their stature at the time. And so that stuff all goes in the collection. We collect a lot of books. We collect a lot of we have a lot of personal effects, again, that were donated over the years, like Liz Renee, who was performing in the 50s and 60s. She was one of Mickey Cohen, the gangster's girlfriends. She actually went to prison because she refused to testify against him in a big case. So we have her gun cleaning kit, which I feel is a really interesting like, of course, Mickey Cohen's girlfriend is going to have a gun. And she's going to have a gun cleaning kit. So, like these interesting sort of insights into people's histories and personalities. And so if you come in the museum, what we have on display mostly are photos and posters. And we have a case with some sort of personal effects. We have like Dita Von Teese's martini glass, her first martini glass from her first tour of that act, which has become ever more big and elaborate as she's become more and more established. And then we have a kind of a stage area, and on that we have set up several costumes representing everything from the 40s up to pretty much like a decade ago.
And do you think there's a lot of stuff out there that just hasn't been discovered yet? Like somebody's grandma somewhere that they didn't know about was a burlesque performer, and all of a sudden they're cleaning out her house and they find a trunk of her stuff. Like, do you think there's some of that stuff out there?
I think less and less. A lot of the stuff in our collection came to us exactly that way. There would be a box on the doorstep at Exotic World, and it would have a note saying, I found this in the attic, and I had no idea that my grandmother was a exotic dancer, but here's her. I mean, we have like a whole set of scrapbooks that a performer did every month. She did a different spread, and she would put all the places she was in, and cocktail napkins and matchbooks and newspaper stories and the program and whatever sort of represented wherever she was, and then turn the page and it's the next month of, and we have like 4 volumes of this, so probably covering 10 years. And someone found them in an attic and just put them in a box and sent them off to Hallandale. So we have a lot of our collection was like that, but as there are fewer and fewer of the performers of the 40s, 50s, 60s left, I think that's going to happen less and less often. And we do still get people contacting us, but more often we've been getting people who have found stuff in like a store and would we be interested. Of course, we use eBay quite a bit. We don't have a ton of money for acquisitions, but we're able to buy photos and sometimes personal effects. But the costumes, I think, just aren't out there. It's kind of an issue for us now, because one thing that's really important to us now that wasn't necessarily as important 20 or 30 years ago is minority performers. And of course, they were even less likely to be preserved. People didn't the sort of mainstream white audiences didn't didn't appeal to them the same way. They were literally exotics. They were the sort of weird act that you threw into your show to provide something different. And so very few of them attained the sort of fame of a Gypsy Rose Lee or a Sally Rand or a Lily St. Cyr or Tempest Storm. And so their stuff has most likely just disappeared. And now we would really like to have that representation. We would really, there was a whole circuit of black performers, and there were quite important people that came out. Red Fox started in burlesque. LaWanda Page, who played the aunt with him on Sanford and Son, was a burlesque dancer and spun fiery tassels, and she was called the fire goddess of burlesque. And Angel Lee, who was Little Richard's longtime partner, also performed burlesque often with his band, and it's like almost impossible to find anything about those people, and those were the top of the field. So it's very hard for us to build that part of our collection. And of course, there was also a huge Asian burlesque world on the West Coast that were only luckily some of the performers have lived quite a long time and are still alive, and are now able to give us some costumes. But the stuff that really represented the height of that scene in the 40s and early 50s is just gone.
Perusing the website earlier today as well, I came across you guys have the Burlesque Hall of Fame School of Striptease. How cool is that?
Very cool.
I love the fact that people can book and go in and book a run of classes or come in for just a quick little introductory session and really get into the world of burlesque and learn a little bit about it and learn a few moves. And really, it looks like it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it was something that we always had wanted to be part of the museum when we had the space for it. So we have, when we designed this space, we made sure we have this sort of studio, multi-purpose space that we can use for that. We started last summer doing these drop-in classes once a week, and you come in and take just all kinds of, we had beginners classes, we had sort of intermediate level classes. And then just right now we're in the middle of our first multi-session class. So we're doing an 8-week class that is really covering all the bases of getting involved for newcomers. And that's been so successful that I think we're going to launch in the new year. We're going to relaunch that class, but we're also going to do an intermediate class. And then we'll go back and forth and put the one-off classes in between those 8-week sessions. And we're very lucky here in Las Vegas that although some of those shows that we talked about earlier are not strictly speaking burlesque shows, a lot of them hire burlesque performers. And so we have some really great burlesque performers that, that are willing to work with us and sort of come in and guest teach a class or whatever. And a lot of those legends retired out here. And so we have about a dozen performers from 75 and before who, some of them are really good teachers. And so we're able to get some of these performers who worked in, on stage in 1968 to come in and teach the sort of classic styles and teach some of the things that aren't really as big of a part of the modern burlesque. And so people are able to kind of learn a much broader path. And again, continue that process of trying to connect the older generations with the new generations.
I absolutely love it. I saw it on the website and I thought, I've got to talk about this, and I got to get you to get that out there because, again, it's just such a cool idea and just seems like it would be so much fun for people to get involved with. Yeah.
And what we're doing is this year we launched a a quarterly show at a local venue. And so for the 8-week class, we're doing a group act with them that they'll all learn, and then they'll be able to debut on that stage when we do our show at the end of the month.
That's so cool.
And hopefully we'll be able to do that for each 8-week class. We'll sort of time them out so that they'll end at the same time that we have one of our next shows coming up.
It's so cool. I just love it. Dustin, if people want to learn about the Burlesque Hall of Fame, you guys, of course, are online. You're on social media. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so burlesquehall.com is our website. It's burlesquehall.com. We are at the Burlesque Hall on Facebook, and we're at Burlesque Hall on both Twitter and Instagram. And we are lucky enough, like I said, to have thousands of photos and of course, be creating more and more photos every year with our events. And so we have a really great Instagram feed. I'm really proud of it because we just have tons of great images to share. And so they can find out about whatever we're doing from any of those resources.
Excellent. Well, Dustin, thank you again for taking the time to chat today. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to checking out the Burlesque Hall of Fame on an upcoming trip.
Great. Thank you. It's been really nice talking with you.
Once again, if you want more information on the Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum, visit them online at burlesquehall.com and be sure to check out their social media as well. They're on Twitter and Instagram at Burlesque Hall and on Facebook at The Burlesque Hall. And that puts the wraps on yet another episode of the podcast. If you've got feedback on this episode of the show, or any other episode for that matter, or you're after suggestions for your next Las Vegas vacation of where to stay, where to eat, what to do, or what to see, or maybe you've got ideas for topics you'd like me to cover on the podcast, please reach out to me via Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Jeff Does Vegas. Or you can drop me an email directly at jeff@walkernewmedia.com. As for my next Vegas trip, it's coming up December 15th to 19th for my annual Las Vegas birthday trip. My wife will be joining me on this one, and we've already started planning out our shows, shopping, and eats, and we have plans to spend some quality time with our Vegas family so we can deliver some Canadian treats to them just in time for Christmas. In the meantime, thank you so much for checking out the show. Be sure to subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts so you'll know the moment new episodes are available. Make sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Podbean. And don't forget to visit jeffdoesvegas.com for past episodes and show notes. My name is Jeff, and this has been episode number 46 of the Jeff Does Vegas podcast.